Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the New Generation Entrepreneur Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about the old ways of operating and the problems it may cause inside of your life. I don't even really know where I want to start with this concept. Maybe I can start with a story and maybe just see where it takes us. But there's something that I've been seeing a lot of lately, and that is people wanting to hold on to old paradigms and old ways of operating when the environment around them is constantly changing. And it actually causes a lot of problems. And this isn't just related to business, although it is related to business, but this is just in life in general. Like I'll just use an example here. Let's say I had a certain lifestyle I'm 38 years old. And let's say I had a certain lifestyle that I just was familiar with and that I liked. And then all of a sudden I got diagnosed with something. I don't want to put anything in the universe. So let's just say I got diagnosed with something, not so serious, but something that I wanted to get healed from. And I was like, okay, cool. I'm on this like health journey now. I'm like on this healing journey. Well, I can't keep operating within the same paradigms. I can't keep operating the way that I was operating, because the way I was operating caused the problem. And so the environment or the situation has changed, which means it will require me to change. And so we see this all the time. And the reason why I wanted to do this episode is because the world is changing, and it's changing fast, and it's changing faster than it ever has. The pandemic has sped things up as well. I personally have never experienced so much change inside of my life than I have in the last year, maybe two. And the more people that I talk to, the more I hear the exact same thing, that there's been so much change and disruption to people's lives. And there's a lot of deeper reasons for this. And I believe that the planet is just going through an evolution. The planet is moving to a much higher frequency vibration. I think a lot of us need to become more aware and conscious and wake up. And I think there's going to be a lot more change to come. I don't think this sped up increase of the amount of change we're experiencing is going to stop. Again, I could be wrong. This is just an estimate. This is just a guess. But I don't think it's going to stop. I think whatever we're experiencing, this shakeup, this shift in vibration, I believe is going to stay the same or increase. And I think, especially over the next 6 years, we'll see it more and more increase. And many of you guys know I do work with a shaman, Don Javier. Many of you may know the stories of Don Juan. So if you're not sure who Don Juan is, you can Google him. There's a lot of books written on Don Juan and his teachings. But Don Javier, that was Don Javier's, Don was Don Juan. And then now Don Javier is my Don. And so he's the shaman that I work with. And he's been talking to us a lot about the shifts and changes and stuff that are happening on this planet. And based off of everything that I've experienced and seen and heard from him and heard from other people, is I don't think it's going to stop. And so what I wanted to do with this podcast episode is talk about how do we adapt and how do we start to change and why we need to do that and what the importance is. Because sometimes there's areas of our life or things that we're doing that we're not even aware of that still need to change in order to hit the results. And I think where I'm going to start is by kind of talking about what has happened with me over the last year. And I have experienced so much change inside of my life that the environment in which I've been operating in multiple areas of my life, well, let me put it this way. There's been so many environmental changes in my life that me operating the same way I did even 2 years ago couldn't survive if I wanted to maintain a lot of the things that were important to me. And I'll give you guys some examples. The way that I showed up inside of my business, how much time I spent, how much things I was micromanaging, that was a way of being, that was a way of operating. But the business was growing, the business is growing, we're getting more traction, that the environment of the business couldn't sustain the old Brandon. And so it was going to cause problems either in the business or in my life or both. So the paradigm of how I was operating had to shift and had to change. in order to keep up with the environmental change, which is the growth of the business. So I had to shift that. There was also ways I was showing up inside of my family, like as a parent, that needed to shift and change. And so I had to shift who I was. The old Brandon, the old paradigm of how I was operating needed to shift. And I've always would call myself a great father, a present dad, someone who spent times with his kids. But then it hit me one day and I was like, realized my son is 8 years old. And I've always thought in the back of my mind, like, one day I will take him fishing and I'll teach him baseball and all of this stuff, like I was always present. I always checked in with him every single day, but there was things that I wanted to do with him. There was ways that before I had kids, I just assumed this is how I'm going to be as a parent, that I wasn't doing. And part of the reason was because I was too involved inside of the business and I had to adjust how I showed up there. And that also changed how I showed up here. So now I was already present, but now I'm way more present with my kids, especially over this last year. So I had to shift who I was. I had to change the paradigm of how I showed up because the external world around me was shifting. And for me, that is Will getting older. He was 8 years old. He's halfway to 16. It was like a big wake up call. Same thing with my wife. We talked a little bit about it on our 100th episode. We talked about the journey of starting a business, but even, she was changing. She was growing as an individual. What she was looking for in a partner and what I was looking for in a partner, because we were both growing at the same time, shifted, which means that we both had to change who we were with the other person. And so how we show up, and for us, it mainly was just communication. So how I was communicating and how she was communicating had to shift. The old paradigm of how communication happened with me and how communication happened with her had to shift. It had to go to the side. And so I had to adapt and change. What we have to realize is that the world is changing and it's changing really, really fast. And in order for you to keep up with it or to thrive inside of this ever-changing marketplace, environment, world, whatever you want to call it, it's going to require change in yourself as well. You're going to have to change the paradigms of how you've been operating because those old ways of operating aren't going to be the same way to get results in this changing marketplace, okay? So you have to understand, number one, that you've learned how to achieve something in the current paradigm you're in now. You've learned how to do something and you've gotten comfortable with it. When that environment starts to shift and change, you need to change how you're showing up. So let me bring this down to an actual example so you understand what I'm saying. If you go to school and your school started at 8 o'clock and you went to that school for 2 years, you've likely developed a routine or way of being that allowed you to get to school at 8 o'clock. And you probably didn't even have to think about it. You're just like, okay, cool, set my alarm for 6:45. I'm going to eat breakfast for 20 minutes, get changed and whatever. And you probably had a certain route that you would take to school. You've created a paradigm, a way of operating inside of your life because the environment in which you lived was 8 o'clock. School starts at 8 o'clock. But let's say after 2 years, you decide to switch schools and it's on the other opposite side of town. And this school started at 7. You can't keep operating with the old paradigm. You can't keep operating under the old environment because the paradigm that you're operating in showed you how to be successful when you were at the school on one side of town that started at 8 o'clock, but not this new town or this new school on the opposite side of town that starts at 7 o'clock. You have to change your paradigm. You have to change the way of operating and being. So that's just one example of what I'm talking about, but that plays out in almost every single area of your life. Your marriage, your relationships, your friendships, how you're showing up inside of the business. This is why businesses fall or plateau, is because people get stuck in old paradigms, old ways of being, and they don't want to adapt and they don't want to change to the new ever-changing environment all around them. A couple of the biggest examples right now is also kids in education. And this is what I can't let out of my mind, which is how do we raise kids in this ever-changing marketplace or this ever-changing world? Because when I was a kid, It was go to college, be successful, like get a degree and you will be successful. And when I didn't graduate college, but had I graduate college, it would have been 2006. Like Uber didn't exist, I don't think yet, or well, at least wasn't as big as it is now. Airbnb didn't exist, like DoorDash didn't exist, Uber Eats didn't exist. Like this online course creator space wasn't really here. Like I think it was mostly like buy books and DVDs and stuff like that. It wasn't like online courses. There was no, like YouTube, I think was maybe just coming out around then, maybe. So no one was really making money off of social media, or no one was making money off YouTube channels and stuff like that, right? So when I was raised, the environment is not anything close to what it is today. So that old paradigm of like go to school and get a degree and stuff like that, that was a great way of operating. That worked most of the time. We also didn't have like self-checkouts. We didn't have AI. We didn't have robots. We didn't have like software that are replacing a lot of jobs. We didn't have that back then. So that paradigm worked. But where it starts to get really scary is when we look at that old paradigm still running. We still look at that operation still running, but the external world is completely shifted and changed. The external world has completely changed how people make money. It has changed how jobs are done. It has changed what jobs are even created. It has changed how many people can follow the passion and make money off of it. There's so many things that have changed, but this old paradigm keeps on running. And where it gets really scary is where parents keep sending their kids through this old paradigm because they themselves cannot adapt to the world that's around them. And we have to look at, how do we start to change this for our kids? Do our kids really need to go to college, or do we really need to teach them other skills like critical thinking, selling, marketing, following their passion, innovation, how to budget the checkbook, or how to file taxes? Like, do we need to start changing the way we educate and bring up our kids? My answer is yes, we absolutely do. And I think we do see it now more and more than ever. We see a lot more different types of homeschooling programs and different types of education. And we just see so many options popping up. But this is what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is when the external world or the environment in which we live starts to change and we want to hold on to old paradigms, it's going to start causing problems in your life, and it could cause problems in other people's lives as well. Like, you keep operating your kids under this old paradigm, it's going to cause problems for them because they're not going to be prepared for this changing world, right? So again, like another way is like, how is money made? That has completely shifted. The environment of how money is actually made is completely shifted over the years. We have things like cryptocurrency now. We have things like Airbnb that make it super easy to invest in properties and rent them out. We have Uber, we have DoorDash. We have ways for you to go and make money really quickly. TaskRabbit is another one. So there's different ways that people can make money, but hardly anyone ever thinks critically. People never question anything. People just fall into this hamster wheel without ever thinking about anything. And they just keep following the model, the old paradigm of what's been around, because I don't know if they're too lazy to think about it. I don't know if people don't like questioning it. I don't know if people don't like change, or what it is. Maybe it's all of it. But you're going to run into problems, especially because I believe that a lot of this change is going to start happening a lot faster. Again, look at the last 10 years of the innovation that we've seen. There's more change in the last 10 years than you've seen in the last 50. And in the next 10 years, you're probably going to see more change than we've seen in the last 10 years. You have to be able to ask questions, question things, think critically. Don't just believe stuff because the media told you this, or the authority told you this, or this person told you this, because they might be operating underneath old paradigms as well. You have to learn how to think for yourself and adjust old paradigms when you recognize them. Okay, so again, also happens in business. This happens when you grow a business. This happens in relationships. But the first part of this is you just have to be good at accepting change. And I think that might be the hardest part for a lot of people, is they just can't accept change. And I get it. Change, it's freaking hard. It really is. This year alone, I've seen the most amount of change in my life than I've ever seen, probably ever. Everything is different. Almost everything is different a year ago than what it is today. who's on my team has changed over the last year. We've had a couple people leave over the last year. How I show up as a father has changed. How I show up as a husband has changed. The relationship I have with my wife has changed. It's just gone to a whole nother level of depth that I didn't even know can exist. Even where I banked has changed, not by my doing, but that has changed. We're selling our house, which we didn't expect, and we're moving out of state, which I didn't expect. There's just so much change at one after another going on inside of my life that I got to a point where I couldn't hold on to things anymore. I had to just let go and just trust that whatever was happening is for my higher good, and that I'm going to adapt to whatever is going to come, and I'm going to be okay. The better you become with change, the better you're going to be at shedding old paradigms. Because the number one reason why people will not shed paradigms or want to shed paradigms is because it will require change. But here's the thing. I don't know if this is true for you, but for me, the most stubborn people I know that will not change happen to also be the people that have the most problems in their life. Have you ever noticed that? The people that are the most stubborn, the most unwilling to change, at least in my life, are also the ones who complain the most, who seem to have the most amount of problems in their life. And I believe it's because they hold on to old paradigms that don't serve them in the current environment in which they live and exist. As a business owner and as a human, as a friend, as a boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, partner, whatever, this is absolutely vital. Some of the other ways that this also works out is in communication, especially in parenting. We have learned ways of communicating. And I see this all the time with people who struggle with messaging is they hold on to the old ways of their communication, and we can't hold on to the old ways of communication. We can't hold on to the old paradigms of communication. If you have conflicts with your kids not listening to you, or your spouse not understanding you, or you guys are constantly fighting, it's probably because you're holding on to an old paradigm, an old way of being, an old way of communication. And a lot of that communication is learned from how we were communicated, especially as parents. We have learned how to communicate from our parents, and we continue to carry that on to our kids or through our relationships that we have in life. And that's a paradigm. And this is what I'm saying is we need to question everything. If there's something going on in your life and there's some sort of conflict, you need to question your responsibility in that. Is there an old paradigm? Is there an old way of being? And is there a way for me to improve this? Get out of your ego, get out of your tenal. And really ask yourselves those questions. Think critically about yourself and where you've learned to communicate from. You have to understand also that listening is a huge part of communication. And I think when it comes to parenting, if we want to build a better relationship with our kids, and again, it's not just parenting, it's everything in our life, we have to support and nurture versus control and be an authority with them in our communication. That requires listening, nurture their emotions, ask how they're feeling, ask why they're upset, and understand and nurture them and guide them to who they are. I think a lot of us have probably had experiences of authority telling us what to do, what is normal, what is right, what we should be, who we should be. And that has to get unlearned. That has to get stripped away, because those are old paradigms that aren't going to serve you. They're not going to serve your kids. They're not going to serve your relationships. So again, if you have some kind of problem in your life, from my experience, it usually is because there's an old paradigm or an old way of being. I'm trying to think of the right way to say this. There's an old way of being. There's an old paradigm that's running that isn't serving you or getting you the results in the current environment in which you live. Okay. So let's go through a couple of ways this may be showing up in your life. It may be showing up with your spouse. You might need to change how you're showing up in the relationship, because here's the thing with relationships. A lot of times we approach them with, what do I want? How do I want that person to change, instead of trying to accept that person for who they are and love them for who they are? It's called conditional love versus unconditional love. But sometimes when we want someone else to change inside of a relationship, we never ask, how do I change? What's the paradigm of which I'm operating in that's not yielding the result in the relationship that I want? And it takes one person to change a relationship. People think it takes two, and it just takes one. If you change the dynamic of how you show up in the relationship, and this could be something like, I'm not going to do what they tell me to do anymore. They try to control me too much, and I'm going to have my personal power and set up a boundary. That's you changing the dynamic. That's you changing the paradigm of how the relationship was. By changing the dynamic or the paradigm, you completely change and transform what the relationship will be in the future. It doesn't necessarily, think of it this way. If your relationship was made of 5 gears and all 5 gears would rotate, do a full rotation, let's just call it in 10 seconds, and that's how they operate, that's how the relationship was. And then you change that paradigm, you enlarge one of the gears, so it's like 10 times longer. It may speed up a rotation to 2, right? It completely changed the result that you get because you changed a paradigm of how it was operating. It's the same thing inside of your relationships. Every single relationship and friendship and relationship with your parents or whatever, it has a way of operating. It's made up of a bunch of different subconscious beliefs and all sorts of stuff. You change that paradigm. You change the relationship. And I'm not saying you're changing it for the better or for the worse, but the same thing with your kids. If you don't like how unconnected you are with your kids, you don't like that you fight with them or they don't listen or they yell or whatever, then change the paradigm of how you're showing up in your kids' life. And if you want a better result, usually from my experience, it happens from supporting, listening, and nurturing versus controlling and being an authority. And it's the same thing with inside of business. With your team. If your team's not operating the way you want them to operate, change the paradigm and how operations work inside of your business. Pretty simple, right? I mean, it's a pretty simple concept, but sometimes it's hard to do. Same thing with messaging. If your messaging, the way you're doing it, isn't working, then change the paradigm of how messaging is done. So let's talk about how do we change the paradigm. There's a couple things that I like to do, let me put it this way. It's as simple as just, number one, recognizing, is there an old paradigm running? Why are these results happening? And then how can I change the paradigm or change how I'm showing up to yield different results? That's really what it is at the end of the day. But when it comes down to it, there's 3 types of people. And I'm hoping that you're going to, over time, become number one, because becoming number one, from my experience, yields just a much happier life. But person number one is you can be the person to change a paradigm. You can be the one who changes the paradigm or the way of being. You can change it in your relationship. You can your relationships with your spouse, friends, parents, employees, kids, whatever. You can be the person that changes the paradigm. You can also be the person who changes the paradigm of your industry. And that's how I look at myself, is like I go into the course creator, the online business space, and I'm changing the way things were done. The old ways of being, the old paradigms that were running and have been running, they cause a lot of problems for people. I'm going to be the one to change that. I'm also the one who changes it inside of my family and inside of my relationships. My wife does too, but we both are. But I am the person who is changing a paradigm. Okay. Number 2 is you could be the person who adjusts to the paradigm shift. Let me give you an example of this. Is if I'm changing the online space and changing how messaging is being done, I'm doing that. There's a lot of people that are adjusting to that shift in the paradigm, like my audience and my students. They are being the person who adapts to that paradigm shift. Inside of a relationship, if you change your spouse changes the paradigm, you can adjust to that and you could be the person who adjusts to it. Person number 1 is great, but you want to be person number 2 as well. You want to be open to the change that someone else is creating. So where you don't want to be is person number 3 is the one who never changes a paradigm or adjusts to the changing paradigms. Those are the people that are stubborn. Those are the people that are way into their ego. Those are the people that are still very unconscious to things going on around them. Those are the people that generally don't like change. But those are also the people that have the most things going on in their life that are not stuff they enjoy. They're the ones that tend to complain the most. Again, from my experience, it's not true 100% of the time, but they're the ones who are stagnant. They're the ones who have the biggest problems with the changing around them. They're the ones who complain the most. They're the ones that are usually that have the most problems. So you have a choice of who you're going to be. Are you going to be the person that changes paradigms, or the person who adjusts to them, or both? Or are you going to be the person who's just going to be stubborn, stuck, and not adjust to the changing world around them? And it's hard work. It's emotionally hard. It's physically hard. It is mentally hard to be the person who's changing those paradigms, but it's also the work that's going to yield the biggest amount of rewards. Okay. So the biggest thing I want to leave you with in this podcast episode is to basically tell you your old way of operating can't stay like that forever, especially when the environment in which you live is constantly changing, because it will lead to problems in one way or another. You can't keep operating the old way in a world that is changing and raising its vibration, its frequency, that's becoming more conscious. You can't keep operating the old way of growing a business and maintaining your relationships, because it will eventually lead to problems. So again, hopefully this was valuable to you. Hopefully it opened up your eyes to a couple things. And I would love to hear your feedback. So if you did like this episode, drop us a DM on Instagram. But more importantly, I always appreciate reviews. So I love reading the reviews. If you guys want to leave us a review on this podcast about any episode or this episode in particular, please go ahead and do that over on iTunes and let me know what you think about our podcast. And I will see all of you guys on another episode. Take care, everyone. Hey guys, thank you so much for checking out another episode of the New Generation Entrepreneur Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, go below, hit the subscribe button, and make sure you click on that bell icon and get notified every time we drop a new episode. Now, if you're looking for the show notes, we have them linked underneath this video, as well as our social media handles and some links to free training and offers that we drop from time to time to help you guys even further. So go check those out if you're interested, and thank you so much for tuning in to the New Generation Entrepreneur Podcast.